Yeah, guys, welcome. This is our first virtual event for Chef Series. Our team's super passionate about food, and I mean, everyone else here too. So we just wanted the opportunity to, bring us all together. The past 2 years during the pandemic, I mean, it's kind of hard to gather everybody globally, and it's insane how many people we've met around the world. Be sure to share your experiences by tagging us using hashtag Alpha Chef Series. I'm gonna pass it on to Justin.
This is a dish that I make for my wife pretty frequently, just kind of as a quick, easy weeknight meal. And it is a base of a recipe which can be altered in as many ways as you would kind of like. So if you don't want to use mushroom and you want to use Chinese sausage, if you don't want to use tofu and you want to use salmon, there are a gajillion different ways that you can kind of like modify this. We should talk about our mushrooms. This is a mushroom tofu noodle bowl. I have a combination of shiitakes and button mushrooms. These have just been kind of like brushed, and I chopped these before the camera kind of turned on. I have some spring onions, and we're gonna do this in two ways, where you kind of use the tops, the greens, as kind of a garnish and kind of a extra textural component of the dish, and then the bottom section ends up really adding a lot of flavor to the noodles. Garlic's kind of a heated one because some people shy away from it. Some people will use like half of a clove because it just doesn't catch their vibe, but I will add 3-4 cloves of garlic to this recipe, and I think it's delicious. Lime for acidity. I have a little bit of tamari that's just constantly in kind of a squeeze bottle. I have like 4 or 5 of these, just they just stay next to my stove. What's nice about tamari, and the reason that I'm using it, is just in case there was anybody who is gluten-free tonight. And so if you want to make this whole entire recipe gluten-free, you can use tamari and you can use rice noodles, and then that ends up being, this entire recipe doesn't have any gluten in it, which is really, really nice. I have my noodles. These are just kind of like a lo mein style noodle. Hot sauce that I have is, it's called sun sauce that I'm using. I listed this as an optional ingredient because I know that people do like to go spicy on their noodle dishes. And so if you have your favorite, feel free to bring it out. And then I have extra firm tofu, which is, just out of its package. I'm just sitting in a bowl here. So I haven't really done anything fancy yet.
Do we need to drain dry this tofu?
I poured all the water off of mine. So yes, sometimes the solution that it's in helps it stay firm. And then also it makes it so it doesn't dry out. I have not prepped anything. As we're kind of talking about prep, I will kind of move on to talking about hardware. Cutting board with just kind of like your favorite vegetable chopping knife. This can be a chef's knife. This can be like a little kind of like shorter utility knife if you want. This can be like a kind of cleaver style knife like I have here. Doesn't have to be anything special. We're not doing any fancy butchery techniques or anything that's going to require anything super sturdy. Just whatever you like to chop vegetables with. And because we're using this with, some kind of stringy onions, if you have one that doesn't have a bunch of the teeth in it, if it's not a serrated one, I find that tends to work a little bit better. Same thing with the mushrooms, works a little bit better. On my stove, I have 2 pots. I have one that is kind of like a medium to large pot that I have like 2/3 of the way filled up with water. And that's on kind of just like a medium heat that will kind of be preheating as we're chopping all of our vegetables. And then when it's time to cook the noodles, that water is ready and you don't have to like, oh my goodness, I haven't even turned my water on. So you can go ahead and start with that. And then this pot here, which is just kind of like a medium sauce pot, I'm going to be making like our flavorful noodle sauce veggie kind of base in there. If you want to broil your tofu or grill your tofu, you can certainly do that. And so if you're the type of person that likes a little bit of color on your tofu, you can turn your broiler on right now and just kind of like line a sheet tray with some foil. And we'll get to that when it's time to do tofu. If you want to just dice your tofu and fold it in at the end, that's also totally fine. For the scallion garnish, if you want to do a fun chef trick that we do to get these kind of like curled pieces of scallion tops, you can just grab like a little bowl or a plastic container, Tupperware container, and I just have like a little bit of ice in here with some water. Because when we add some of these like thinly sliced green onion tops to the ice water, it kind of like shocks them and they curl up, and it's like a really beautiful garnish. But if you want to just kind of like cut your green onions on a bias like you normally do and just store those in a little bowl for the end, that's also totally fine.
Is cutting on a bias, is that just to increase surface area? Is that also presentation or like a combo?
Chefs have done a fantastic job over the years of creating knife cuts that are an inherent flex. If I want to do it on a bias, I have to be a little bit more thoughtful, and I have to spend a little bit more time kind of like doing a smaller bunch, kind of squaring up and kind of like going slowly so that I have a consistent set of scallions on a bias. And so it's this weird thing of both, it is a little bit of a flex of like, I spent the time to cut these scallions nicely. And at the same time, it's kind of like, it gives a little bit of surface area additionally, because like these are pretty thin. So the only thing that we're doing right now is getting our cutting board and our knife, gathering all of our ingredients in one kind of place, and putting our pot on with some water to boil our noodles in. You can certainly trim the top section and then just kind of come down and do little coins. You can turn and you can cut on a bias, or I'll show the kind of fancy way to take, I'm gonna say like maybe like 1.5 inch piece of the top section. And then you wanna leave your bottom sections for the flavoring piece of the noodles. And then what you're gonna wanna do is take this scallion and kind of fillet it open. And I'm getting like super advanced knife cuts right at the beginning, but for the foodies who kind of want something fun, this is really fun. And so you end up with these kind of sheets of scallions because you roll it open, if that makes sense. And then you can stack these and you can slice them along almost like how celery runs up and down. And then if you slice those, you end up getting these kind of like thin, wispy pieces of scallion, which look like this. And then if these go into ice water, and you guys want to do that now, these will be a really beautiful garnish for your noodle dish. So with the bottoms, so these kind of like, these are the green tops are gone, and we obviously don't want to throw these away. I had a chef once who would get really upset when he would see the kind of like, you know, that stereotypical 1 centimeter of scallions in the trash, because he's like, that's the sweetest part of the scallion. And if you think about it, it's true, because it's where the root is. So I like using the whole onion. If that's not something that you're into, please don't feel like you have to. But yeah, I'm just gonna kind of, you can choose, go on a bias or just go into coins, and we're just gonna kind of like 1/4 inch, and we're gonna cook these down so there's no pressure for these to be perfect. This is that whole piece of, you know, mise en place that you hear chefs talk about, right? It's a rough translation, but it kind of just means like everything in its own place. And that is just this whole kind of gist of, before you start to do anything, you should know, do you have tofu in the fridge? Are the noodles here? Do you have enough? Have you cut your mushrooms and washed them? Versus this idea of just kind of like doing one thing, stuttering and stopping, and then having to come back, and then you could do your cutting board thing. But yeah, I always like to teach that as kind of like a first principle in these sessions, because if you're not cooking with kind of a mise en place kind of mindset, it can become really frustrating to cook at home. But once you kind of do, it's almost like a life hack. So our onions are cut. I'm gonna go into garlic next. I'm probably gonna pick like 3 or 4 of these cloves, and then I'm just gonna, I take the garlic clove, I put my knife just kind of on top, and with the heel of my hand, I just kind of smash down, and that kind of compresses it, and it makes it really easy for me to just separate the peel from the garlic clove. A reminder, if you didn't do the step of putting your water on for your noodles, that you should go ahead and do that. I just have mine in a kind of like medium to large stock pot here on my stove. And I don't have it at kind of like a rolling boil. It's not going crazy. It's chilling and getting ready to go to temperature when I need it. If you want to kind of add a little bit of garlic without having it be so either pungent or kind of in your face, you can just kind of chop garlic into big hunks. Like you can take a clove like this and cut it into just 3 pieces, and it's just going to slightly kind of give a little bit of flavor to the dish. Versus if you were to kind of really go at this and chop it super, super small, turn it into almost like a paste, that's going to be really intense. I just kind of run my knife through the garlic once or twice, and that's more or less kind of enough for me. Mushrooms are pretty straightforward. You guys can also decide what you end up wanting to do aesthetically for your mushrooms. If you were to just want to have like big pieces of mushroom, you can just quarter your mushrooms and just have, you know, decently large pieces like this. That's totally fine. If you want to have more of kind of like a slice, you can have just some slices like this. This will certainly cook a little bit faster. If you need dinner up really fast, you're actually better off just kind of like spending the extra 2 minutes to cut your vegetables or your meat a little bit smaller, and you're going to save time either in the oven or on the stove. Even with my shiitakes, you can totally eat the stems of these. If you end up having a stem that's a little bit woody or a little bit hard, or it looks a little dried out, you can just trim that off. I already cut my crimini mushrooms already. Very similar size to my shiitakes, same thickness. I just went ahead and turned my broiler on in my oven because I do want to do my tofu in that way. This is going to kind of just be the last knife cut that we have. I went with kind of an extra firm tofu. If you have one that's just normal firm or even just kind of like medium firmness, that's also totally fine. You can choose, if you like larger pieces, you can just go in half and then make strips, turn all of those strips and then make cubes. If you want to have something like strips and enjoy that as part of the noodle dish, that's also totally fine. So I'll show an example of that.
What affected your firmness choice for this dish, and what was?
It's just my preference. Like I just like firmer tofus. I think if it's going to be something like a soup-based dish, or something where I want it to be a little bit more tender, then I'll go with a softer tofu. But because I love grilled tofu. Here's an example of some tofu pieces you can do. If you want to do something that's like more like a cube, you can certainly do that as well. Fun tip, if you are going to grill this or cook it in a saute pan or put sesame seeds on it or do whatever, it's sometimes nicer to work with larger pieces of tofu like this, especially if you're in a pan, because you can kind of get color on both sides. And then when it's done, you can take it out and then you can end up, doing your dice on it. Then it's a little bit easier to manage, less moisture comes out, and it's easier to cook if you have like larger pieces. And that's kind of what I'll share. And then you can kind of make a decision based on how you want your dish to turn out. But I'm just cutting like a 3/4 inch cube, nothing crazy. And then those are just going to go on a tray. Most tofu comes like reasonably unseasoned. And so if you want to give your tofu a seasoning with, whatever salt mixture you happen to enjoy, if you have one that's kind of like a mix, I'm just adding kosher salt to mine. You can add a little bit of tamari to it. You can drizzle it with some sesame oil right now. I'm just going to do like a basic kind of canola oil on mine, just because that little bit of that fat helps conduct the heat underneath the broiler. It's going to help me get some color a little bit more evenly. Maybe the last piece that we can do is just kind of cut these limes into wedges, and those are just going to kind of be squeezers at the end. Those can just stay in the corner of my cutting board. If you're just using lime juice, that's also totally fine.
How many mushrooms required? I saw you had like 2 bowls of them.
It's really personal preference. If you only have like 1 handful of mushrooms, it's still going to be super delicious, but you can kind of choose however many you want.
Okay, I've got about a mountain here, so I think I'm good.
That's great. That's great. They'll cook down as well. And so if it ends up being a lot, you can also just kind of like remove some of the mushrooms before we kind of like mix it with the noodles. And then you won't have so many in the noodles, and then you'll have just kind of like a mushroom base you can use for later on. So I have started my kind of like medium sauce pot here on like a medium high heat. I'm not like completely cranking it, but I'm also not on kind of like anything gentle. And I had a little bit of water in there, so I'm going to let that evaporate a little bit. Sometimes if you have a recipe that calls for a base of onions and garlic, sometimes if you add the garlic and the onions at the same time, your garlic starts to get color before your onions do. And that can be really frustrating, because then if you have one of 2 choices, either deal with onions that don't have any color on them, or continue to cook it and risk burning your garlic, which is also not a great flavor. And so I leave mine separate for that reason, so that we can kind of have a little bit more of a dialed in control as we're kind of cooking these. You can use your oil of choice, peanut oil, sesame oil, canola oil, and add maybe like 2 tablespoons. It's going to feel like a lot, but by the time this all kind of like cooks down with our mushrooms, it's also going to infuse with kind of our onions and our garlic all together. And the best noodle dishes have that kind of like enough of the fats to kind of coat all of the noodles, which is really, really delicious. So that's what I'll start with. And then I'll go ahead and I'll add my chopped scallions. At this stage in the game, salt helps a lot because it draws moisture out of your onions and your garlic. And so it helps that flavor base cook faster. And if you weren't wanting to use mushrooms, you can use cabbage, you can use celery root, you can use carrots in this. Broccoli is really, really yummy. So yeah, we're getting just a little bit of color on the edges. Nothing kind of crazy yet. I want to take mine like reasonably far. Like I like to have a little bit of char on my onions. I think that's really delicious because you have so much fat in the pan. A lot of the good flavor molecules are fat soluble. And so by having a little bit of extra fat in there through your cooking oil, you're actually creating like this really flavorful scallion oil in the pan right now. I'm getting color on my onions, which is all really, really good. You can go a little bit darker than this if you want, but what you want to do is you're starting to overlap now. So I'm going to add my garlic and start to get some color on that so that hopefully these both end up kind of getting sweated out and infused. And the garlic goes fast, so just kind of like be aware of that and don't kind of like put it in and walk away, because burned garlic is hard to recover from. I have my broiler on high, and that's just kind of preheating right now. So when it's time for us to add the tofu and get some color on it, we will. So golden edges. I might get a little bit of like char on the onions, but you can see I kind of have like a decent amount of kind of like this scallion garlic oil that's going to dress all of our noodles. It's going to be really delicious. Now, once you kind of get to that stage, you can start to add your mushrooms. And as we were kind of talking at the top of the session, mushrooms have a lot of water in them. And so when they're one, sliced, and two, exposed to heat, all of that water kind of almost ends up getting kind of like forced out of the mushroom. And so that kind of like helps stop the cooking of all of these kind of like the onions and the garlic, which is also really nice. So I'll just give it a stir. If you end up getting any sticking in your pot, you can add a little bit of your tamari to kind of just like, because we haven't added any salt to our pot yet. And so there's no stress. All right. So I'm at kind of this stage, right? So I have like some color on probably like 60% of my mushroom. I'm going to kind of like start to zhuzh this up a little bit. That's not a very technical term. So I'm going to add probably like a quarter cup of tamari, and I want mine to be a little bit spicy. So I am going to add probably like, I don't know, half a tablespoon of my hot sauce, because this is really hot. So you probably know how hot your hot sauce is. And I won't add my my lime juice until the end. And so then what you end up getting is this kind of like, it's like a ragu almost of mushrooms, caramelized scallions, and like this toasted garlic oil that's going to be kind of like the base for our noodles. Now we can do our noodles. So this is pretty straightforward. You can go ahead and just take a look at what the instructions say on the back. I do like to salt my noodle water. It just, I can taste it when there's salt. You might not think, I don't know. I can taste it if noodles have been kind of cooked in salted water or not. And so I just go ahead and add those. And then just as they kind of cook and soften, press them down a little bit so that they all get submerged. And go ahead and taste these. Like, this has probably been like 3-4 minutes on mine, and mine says to do it for like 7 or 8. But pull them early, because you can always cook them for just a touch longer, but you can't make them go backwards. And so just kind of keep that top of mind.
At what point do you take the mushrooms and stuff off the heat?
When you feel like you have a decent level of color on them, and if your mushrooms ended up, you know, giving up a lot of liquid, and you want to kind of have like a more like a tighter sauce on your noodle, you can certainly continue to reduce it down and cook out some of that moisture. Yeah, don't cook it so far down that you end up kind of having like a dry, like stir-fried mushroom and onion mixture. And then another thing that I did is I just left like the tiniest bit of my noodle water kind of in the pot here, just because that starch helps kind of like create a little bit of body in the sauce, but it's nothing crazy. It's not kind of like sitting in a thick amount of liquid. So now that our noodles are done, you can also go ahead and take your tofu. If you are going to be cooking it, I just have mine in on the top rack of a broiler.
How long do you broil the tofu for?
So mine's been in for probably, I'm gonna call it like 3 minutes. It looks like that. So I don't have a ton of color yet, but I'm starting to get some crispy edges, and I'm just gonna let this go for probably another like 2-3 minutes. And you might have also probably noticed that like I haven't tasted the mushroom mixture yet because I intentionally want that to be like really in your face flavorful, because that has to season all of these noodles. And so that's probably really salty. It's probably a lot of umami. And because of the amount of this really spicy chili sauce that I added, it's probably really spicy. But I over index on that because I want that to season this whole entire pot of noodles that I have. I will add it, and then I will add a little bit more chili sauce, add a little bit more tamari. We're gonna add acidity from our limes. All those things are gonna kind of come into play. So my tofu is definitely hot. And now all of it kind of comes together. And so I'll show 2 different ways maybe. That might be the nice way to structure this. So one we can do as kind of like you build it inside of the bowl, and you can kind of toss everything together on your own. So that will be noodles down. You can kind of stir your mushroom mix together, kind of do a big heaping spoon just kind of in the middle, and then do a little kind of drizzle of your sauce kind of around, and then snag a couple of pieces of tofu and kind of just plot those around so that there's a decent amount of tofu around everything. And then we can garnish with some sesame if you want. And then if everybody's checked on their spring onion strands, they're probably these like beautiful curls now. And you can just kind of make a little nest of those just on top. And then you can serve that with a little lime wedge. And that looks like that. And then option 2 is to kind of just mix everything together. And so you can go ahead and add your mushroom mix to your noodles. So adding that kind of mushroom tamari mixture is kind of turning our noodles brown. It's seasoning everything. And you can make the call here. So if you want to add your tofu now and mix everything together, you can. You can do kind of like a hybrid approach with my other one. Inside the pot here, you can do a preliminary squeeze of lime. So like the noodles have a little bit of acidity to them, and then you can still serve it with the lime wedge. And you can add some sesame seeds now too, if you want. So kind of everything's just mixed together. This is nice for meal prep. If you want to do something like this, you mix everything together, and then you can kind of, divvy this up into a couple different containers for you to eat for lunch or dinner throughout the week. If you get your bowl like this, and you have some chopsticks, you can kind of like roll the whole bowl together to kind of like make a little bit more of an elegant shape of your noodles, depending on the shape of your noodles, and you can the length of your noodles. You can kind of have like a little tight plate up, and then you just go ahead and add your tofu pieces either on top or just mix it in, and then garnish it exactly the same. Add our little nest of spring onions or chopped ones, even if you didn't do this kind of fancy move. And then you can just squeeze your lime over the top.
Wow.
And I probably have like at least another bowl in the pot here after these kind of 2 small plate ups that I did. So how did everybody do?
I'm hungry. Wow, Chelsea, yours looks so good. Guys, remember to take photos. I want to see all of this.
Yeah.
Mickey, oh my gosh.
Yeah, let's see it. Shirt in front of the camera. We'll spotlight it.
Here.
Ooh, Mickey.
I know, Mickey's looks so good. Everyone's just eating now.
That's great.
I'm hungry.
Tofu is so crispy and the texture is.
Hey Justin, how would you describe these spring onions after being cooled with the ice water?
when they were on my prep list, I think we called them threads, like spring onion threads, I think is what we called them.
They're gorgeous.
Yeah, they're a no-brainer. I call it a finishing move. So I think that everybody could really feel a lot more confident or feel like they are a more seasoned chef in the kitchen if everybody just got used to using finishing moves a little bit more. If you want this to have even more depth, you can do like when you add the tamari and the hot sauce, you can add a little bit of miso and kind of fold that in. You can add seaweed, like you could add like seaweed crackers to the top of this. That would be really, really delicious. Yeah, thanks everybody for joining.